Hello, and welcome to Chaotic Insights, where I break down the TV show Chaotic, and maybe the TV show isn't the only thing that's chaotic. Today we'll be talking about Season 2, Episode 5, Rockwave and Roll. So grab a snack, start your laundry, and we'll dive right in. Episode summary: Peyton has a drum match against Noisemaker, who happens to be Eddie X, a famous lead singer of one of Peyton's favorite bands. So Peyton picks an unexpected combination of creatures to honor Eddie X, and he lets him win a couple of rounds. Eddie, wanting a real competition, offers Peyton backstage passes to his concert if Peyton can beat his creature named Screamer. Screamer's special ability allows him to borrow battle gear from his fellow teammates, so Peyton figures out that he has to beat Eddie's whole team in order to defeat the Screamer creature. Now, Tom and Kaz are both rooting for Peyton so that they can also get backstage passes and go with Peyton to the concert, while Sarah seems disinterested in the band and the passes. It comes down to Hearing versus Screamer, and Peyton squeaks out the win. Peyton brings Sarah to the concert with the other backstage pass and leaves Tom and Kaz at home. And that's the episode we're dealing with. So I'm actually kind of excited to talk about this episode, and I don't know why, but let's get into it. So, analysis: this really is a Peyton focused episode, and it follows our big match format, like plot structure, where Peyton and Eddie are in the big match, and Sarah, Tom, and Kaz are our commentators who either explain things or push the narrative forward through their commentating. And I really think that it's interesting so far in season 2. We are kind of further differentiating our chaotic stories and our Param stories. Like episode 1 and 2, and even looking ahead to the next one, they almost exclusively take place in Param, versus this episode and the last episode, Floundering Father, are basically exclusive to a chaotic drone match. And I think it's interesting that, like, in our first season, we get a lot of like what I would call this typical format of a chaotic episode is like you have the chaotic match and that somehow ties into a Param adventure, like with an A plot B plot situation, or we like learn something in the cold open that affects the drone match later, or we learn something in the drone match that goes on to affect the Param story. Like they pretty often interweave going to Param and having a chaotic battle into like the narrative importance, versus these really differentiate that further of like this is just a drone match and we're telling a drone match story, or say like, the Coliseum Showdown episode was like an exclusively Param episode. And season 2, episode 2, the Rasmus episode, is I think closest to what I would call that typical format of like, we're in Param and then he scans Rasmus, he learns something in the match, and then like immediately goes back to Param. But the majority of that time is spent in Param, that like they still interweave a match, but it's still like further differentiating. We're not seeing a whole match, we're seeing like a battle and then Tom forfeits. So I think that goes to show how in season 2 they're experimenting a little bit more, which you would think that, having a story focus on something isn't being experimental, but they are straying from this typical format in order to tell more specific and stories with more depth to them. Because when you have an A plot, B plot, you can only get so much depth because you have a limited amount of time, versus when you spend one whole episode on something, you're able to give it more room to breathe and create more depth in that one plotline. So whether they focus on just a match or just Param, they're able to dig deeper into one narrative. Like this episode and the Floundering Father episode are both drone matches, but like with a twist, and they're able to dig deeper into that one story. And I actually think that I want to compare and contrast these episodes a little bit, right? In Floundering Father, we have a dynamic character who is the father, Buzz, and he goes through character growth or emotional change, and the focus was not one of our four main characters, right? They spend the time to introduce us to this new character and we can see him, you know, be dynamic and grow and change. Versus this episode, Peyton is our dynamic character, and the change isn't like emotional growth or like a character change. It's more of the physical challenge of a drum match. Like the conflict is man v man, which is inherent to all chaotic battles, but the motivation is different. Like Peyton doesn't originally want to fight because he loves Eddie, right? And he, wants to offer Eddie the honor of winning. But Eddie offers the passes, so Peyton becomes motivated to win because he loves Eddie and he wants the passes and to have that experience. And his change from wanting to lose the battle to wanting to win the battle holds the same motivation, but it adds, the physical challenge that comes with that, the man v man struggle of defeating his opponent. Whereas Buzz, whose challenge was really man v self, because he had to overcome his arrogance in order to win his son's favor, right? Like Buzz went through an emotional change and it resolved like the emotional man v man conflict between him and his son, which wasn't the same as the man v man of him versus Kaz in the Drome. Versus here, the challenge isn't really an emotional conflict, right? There is no emotional growth in this episode. It is overcoming the physical of being determined in the battle and overcoming the stakes and having a battle that is interesting and challenging and fun to watch. And I bring this up because I think it's interesting that we can have the same general premise of an episode of this is a drone match, we're watching a chaotic battle, which uses basically the same narrative techniques to propel the plot forward, but these two stories are infused with very different DNA because one is emotional and one is like a physical challenge. But isn't that the whole point of a TV show to, have the same premise but come up with something new, come up with something interesting within the bounds? And I think, Chaotic is really achieving that in season 2. We're keeping, a drone match premise, but we're putting twists on it. And the concept of this episode to me feels very fan fiction. It feels very fanficky. Like, what if you played against your favorite celebrity in the Drome? Would you freak out? Would you play it cool? And that's what they explore within Peyton. It's like, what if Zayn from One Direction ended up playing Yu-Gi-Oh or something? Wouldn't that be crazy? Famous people need hobbies too, so it's not out of the question that like someone who's famous could be good at a card game. You know, they have free time and, Eddie X was good at the online game, probably played it on tour, and then got his access code to Chaotic, and now he's a Chaotic player. And the drum is like the great equalizer because there is this like inherent power dynamic in place between this adult celebrity and this teenage fan. But in the Drome, they're just players, They're playing a game and either one could win, and it's not about like this power dynamic that Peyton is definitely in tune with. They both have an equal chance of winning the game, with their strategy and with their playing abilities. So even though this concept feels very self-insert fan fiction, I think it's executed in a way that really tonally matches the rest of Chaotic, and it is a fun twist on the format. Or not necessarily on the format, but it's a good twist on the premise. It's a good concept for an episode. And this episode is supposed to be a lot more comedic. Like, it is kind of standalone, but there's a lot more jokes, and the fate of Param isn't at stake. It's just kind of a light-hearted, fun episode in this what if scenario. What if you, met your favorite celebrity across from you in the Drome? And in addition to that, I think this episode does a nice job of flipping what I would call the fangirl stereotype because a lot of the times in media, the fangirl is made out to be, this like teenage girl who freaks out when they meet a celebrity. And I think they flip it, one with, having Peyton fulfill this fangirl role, right? It's not necessarily a fangirl, it's just a fan, right? He's geeking out over the fact that his favorite celebrity is in front of him. And so flipping the gender of the character who is fanning out or geeking out over their favorite celebrity, I think helps to normalize that it's okay to be a man and have emotions. It's actually cool to be passionate about something, and it's cool to have interests. And in our modern culture, I think there is this standard to flanderize men into like an emotionless being, right? A man is supposed to be perceived as strong, and that turns into emotionless, which means they're not allowed to express excitement or joy. And seeing Peyton here as a positive role model for the audience who is being openly expressive and passionate and acting like the fangirl stereotype but subverting the gender expression is actually kind of progressive when you think about it because it offers a different but still realistic narrative from what is typically portrayed in media, right? It's different from the stereotypes and the societal expectation and gender norms from what is typically portrayed in other media. And so I think that is interesting and unique. On to lore. This episode introduces Screamer as a creature who doesn't have a card in real life, and his special ability is that he can borrow battle gear from his teammates, and this feels like an example of the show creating a card for narrative reasons instead of drawing on the canon of cards that we have existing in the real world or real life packs or like, past iterations of the cards. It also feels similar to they have this guitar battle gear in this episode that I don't think I've seen a battle gear that's a guitar currently, or not off the top of my head at least. And so that feels like another version of, they're just narratively reinforcing the themes through creating a creature like Screamer who uses his voice to attack, or using a guitar. Like they're weaving this music motif through this episode and also like the concept of sound attacks is I don't say introduced, but they like title it in this episode, which makes sense like some of these attacks are sound attacks. But that's not like a designated category in the chaotic card game or like in the lore specifically. And so instead of like using a fire attack which has certain effects, like sound effects seem to be just a more like neutral thing that people can do. And honestly, this episode has more lore about like the real world in the show, like the fictional real world of Chaotic, rather than Chaotic itself or Param. Like we learn about Eddie X and that he's a famous person and the lead singer of Eddie and the Conflagration, and that they have multiple albums, and that Tom, Kaz, and Peyton all like their music, and that's just another example of their interests outside of chaotic and how they're well-rounded individuals. So I feel like we get a lot of like real world lore in this episode, which I think is also unique to this episode. Now, on to fun facts and other notes. I think this episode has some good jokes, and I think my favorite was the setup was something along the lines of I have all your albums, and the punchline is I even paid for most of them. And I think that's a funny joke on pirating. And some other things I have to note in our fun facts other notes section is the animation change. So one, we get a shot of the purple claw drone, which this time is more purple and now has like a big A on it, which is fun and interesting, I guess. But also we get to see Peyton's room again, but this time in the new animation style. So this is a comparison from we get to see it in episode 31, and basically everything is the same except for some coloring, right? The composition of his room is the same, but the walls, the floor, the trim, and the door are all now different colors. And even like the explosion tapestry is now blue. But everything is in the same place, like physically. All the clutter, all the posters, the guitar, the skateboard. I'm pretty sure there's even a t-shirt on the ground in the same spot. Like if you look at his room side to side, it's just like everything is the same, it's just colored differently. And I think that is fascinating. Like, why make those choices? Or like, who made those choices and in what, like, they obviously were looking at the old animation as a reference. So, like, was the color differentiation necessary or was it just a different part of the process? these are things I would like to know. And another thing we get is a new exterior um, building for the port court. So all those things different in the animation change. Just interesting to note. And one more thing I would note is I really thought, like in my memory, I thought in this episode there would be a lot more music puns or references, but there definitely are some in this episode, but not as many as I expected, right? Like Peyton builds his team in honor of Eddie X, which has a lot of like fan references, but for a show that uses so many references, especially in music, the crescendo, the decrescendo, the transposition, I kind of expected them to weave just a little bit more into this episode. And I think my memory's serving me wrong, not a failure on this episode itself. So, my final thoughts on this episode, I like this episode. I think it's memorable. And even though I think the character is constantly hitting high notes, it can get annoying, and it definitely annoyed my parents when I was little. But, for me, I knew what to expect. I thought it was fine this time around. And this episode really prompts you to think about, like, what would you do in this situation? What would you do if you met a celebrity? What would you do if you were battling a celebrity in Chaotic? Which celebrity would you want that to be? You know, it kind of, I feel like it prompts you to create your own self-insert fan fiction of this situation with a celebrity of your choosing. And so isn't that interesting? And something I don't have written down here, but I was thinking about, like, in between when I wrote the script and me coming now to record, something I was thinking about is I went to a concert recently, and it was an arena tour, and so there wasn't a backstage. And so backstage passes for, Eddie X and his band, they are in a venue, right? They are on a tour in a venue at a show, but the venue has to be like a theater, right? They have to be at a theater tour in order to have immediate wing space where Peyton and Sarah are standing. They have to be in a theater. And so I think that gives us insight onto the size of this band's popularity, right? I did a quick Google just now, and for a theater venue, you could be looking at up to like 3,000 people. But for an arena tour, that could be like 20,000 people. And this is definitely not a stadium tour either. And so this, rock band that Peyton and Tom and Kaz all like has to be, you know, famous enough to be doing this for a living, but not famous enough to be doing like an arena tour or doing stadium tours. They're like sitting at that level of selling out a theater or like a venue of similar size in order to have an immediate backstage like they do in this episode. And so that's just something I was thinking about. And I can't tell you why that's relevant or cool, but it is something noteworthy. Like, it makes sense, like, when you're writing this plot of, oh, you get backstage passes, which, a backstage pass at an arena tour, there is still a backstage, but it's behind the stage or it's like in the actual venue versus having, wing space with legs and drapery. That's a theater. If I've ever seen one, that's a theater. And so that's really all I have to say about this episode. I think it's a good time. I think it's interesting and it prompts you to think. And what more could you want from a chaotic episode? A little bit of action, a little bit of real life commentary if you dig for it. So, with that, thank you so much for watching. I've had a blast. I hope you did as well. And I'll see you next time. Bye.